It sounds like a horror story, but his wife actually kept his severed head in a red velvet bag for 29 years, carrying it with her everywhere she went. That was the only thing left of Sir Walter Raleigh, a man who once held the ocean in his hands, but ended his life like a cheap criminal. His son died in a bloody jungle ambush, and he was dragged out to be beheaded simply because he couldn't find gold for the king. But that prisoner wasn't just some random guy. He was the only man with the guts to openly flirt with the Queen of England right under the court's nose. He was a notorious bad boy, wild enough to throw his expensive cloak into the mud just to keep the Queen's shoes clean, and casually blew smoke in the faces of snobby aristocrats. With the Queen herself having his back, just how recklessly did he play the game to end up with such a bitter, headless fate? He entered the world around 1552 in Devon, a county that forms the rugged, sea-battered chin of England. Devon in the 16th century was not merely a countryside, it was a breeding ground. It was a place where the soil was poor, but the ambition was rich. The men of Devon looked not to the land for their fortune, but to the gray, churning expanse of the Atlantic. It was a nursery for corsairs, a place where the line between merchant and pirate was non-existent, but it was the political climate that truly shaped young Walter's psychology. He was born a Protestant in a country that had just fallen under the dark shadow of Queen Mary I, Bloody Mary. She was a fervent Catholic, determined to burn Protestantism out of England. He was the youngest son of a sprawling, chaotic family living in a farmhouse called Hayes Barton. His father, the elder Walter Raleigh, was a staunch Protestant who refused to bend the knee to Rome. This was not a matter of quiet disagreement. It was a matter of survival. Young Walter grew up watching his father hide. There were days when the family feared the sound of hoofbeats on the road, knowing it could be the Queen's inquisitors. His father once had to hide in a church tower to escape execution. For a child, seeing your father hunted like an animal implants a deep, vibrating chord of fear and hatred. For Raleigh, the enemy was not an abstract concept. The enemy had a face. It was the Catholic Church, and it was Spain. This hatred became the engine of his life. It was the fuel for his privateering, the justification for his wars, and the obsession that would eventually lead him to the scaffold. He learned early that the world is a binary place. There are the hunters and there are the hunted. He decided very young that he would never be the hunted again. He also learned that he had to fight for his place at the table. He was the fourth son. Under the laws of primogeniture, he would inherit nothing. No land, no title, no money. If he wanted a life, he would have to take it. His greatest assets were his connections. His mother, Catherine Champernoun, was a formidable woman connected to the Gilberts and the Grenvilles, families of high-born adventurers. But connections only open the door. You have to walk through it yourself. By the late 1560s, the teenage Raleigh was at Oxford, registered at Oriel College, but the stagnant air of the lecture halls could not hold him. He was a creature of action, restless and hungry. The books were too quiet. The world outside was burning. In France, the wars of religion were tearing the country apart. The French Protestants, the Huguenots, were being slaughtered by the Catholic League. For a young man raised on stories of Catholic tyranny, this was a clarion call. At the age of 17, an age when modern boys are finishing high school, Walter Raleigh dropped his studies, picked up a pike, and sailed to France to kill. We must pause to consider what this does to a teenage mind. This was not a gentleman's war. It was a savage, chaotic bloodbath. It was a war of ambushes, of burning villages, of neighbors slaughtering neighbors. Raleigh spent nearly 2 years fighting in this hellscape. He saw the aftermath of the Battle of Moncontour. He saw smoking caves where hundreds of Huguenots had been suffocated to death. He breathed in the scent of burning flesh and black powder. History does not record exactly what Raleigh did in France, but it records what he became. He went in a boy. He came out a soldier. He learned the grim calculus of war. He learned that hesitation is death. He learned that mercy is a luxury that the ambitious cannot afford. The fires of France burned away any softness he might have had. When he returned to England, he was no longer just a Devonshire lad. He was a hardened veteran with a 1,000-yard stare and a cynical understanding of human nature. He returned to London, but he was not yet the polished courtier. He was rough. He was loud. He lived in the inns of court, theoretically studying law, but in reality, he was studying life. He wrote poetry that was surprisingly melancholic, hinting at a soul that saw the darkness beneath the surface of things. But poetry does not pay the bills, and poetry does not buy power. Raleigh needed a war. And in 1579, England provided one. The destination was Ireland. If France was his primary education in violence, Ireland was his master's degree. The Desmond rebellions had broken out, a Catholic uprising against English rule, supported by the Pope and the Spanish. For Raleigh, this was the perfect storm, a chance to fight Catholics, a chance to serve Queen Elizabeth, and a chance to seize land. He arrived in Ireland as a captain of foot soldiers. He was 26 years old, tall, dark, and strikingly handsome in a dangerous way. He possessed a physical charisma that drew men to him and a reckless bravery that terrified them. In Ireland, the gloves came off completely. The English viewed the Irish rebels not as soldiers, but as savages. The rules of chivalry did not apply here. Raleigh quickly gained a reputation for extreme ruthlessness. He did not just defeat enemies, he obliterated them. He engaged in guerrilla warfare, hunting rebels through the bogs and forests. He advocated for the assassination of Irish leaders. He was efficient, brutal, and utterly without remorse. And then came the siege of Smerwick in 1580. This is the stain that can never be washed from his legacy. A force of about 600 papal soldiers, Italians and Spaniards, sent to help the Irish, held a fortress on the Dingle Peninsula. The English forces, led by Lord Grey, bombarded them into submission. The garrison surrendered. They waved the white flag. They laid down their weapons, believing they would be treated as prisoners of war. Lord Grey ordered them all to be killed. And the man charged with carrying out this atrocity? Captain Walter Raleigh, the cold wind whipping off the Atlantic. 600 unarmed men standing on the beach waiting. Raleigh, sitting atop his horse, giving the order. His men moved in with swords and pikes. It was not a battle, it was industrial slaughter. They hacked and stabbed until the sand was red and the screams fell silent. Bodies were thrown into the sea or buried in shallow mass graves. Today we call this a war crime. We call it a massacre. But Raleigh wrote about it with a chilling detachment. To him, these were not men. They were agents of the Antichrist, invaders on English soil. He did what he believed was necessary. And more importantly, he did what the Queen wanted. News of his efficiency traveled back to London. In the eyes of Elizabeth I, a woman constantly threatened by assassination plots and foreign invasions, a man who could do the dirty work without flinching was a valuable asset. The massacre at Smerwick did not haunt Raleigh. It launched him. He returned to England in late 1581, not as a ragged soldier, but as a man with a reputation. He was carrying dispatches for the court. He was 30 years old. He had no fortune, but he had a plan. He was going to conquer the greatest fortress of them all, the heart of the Virgin Queen. He arrived at Greenwich Palace with the mud of Ireland still metaphorically on his boots, but he was dressed to kill. He kept his thick Devonshire accent, a rustic burr that sounded masculine and earthy compared to the effeminate lisping of the court dandies. He was 6 feet tall, a giant in an age of smaller men. He was intelligent, dangerous, and dripping with a confidence that bordered on insanity. He was ready to play the game of courtly love, a high-stakes dance where one wrong step meant ruin, but the right step meant possessing the world. He looked at Elizabeth, the woman who held the power of life and death, and he didn't flinch. He walked straight toward her. That bold walk across the floor of Greenwich Palace marked the crossing of a threshold from which there was no return. He was leaving behind the muddy, bloody reality of the soldiers' camp for a battlefield that was far more treacherous, though it smelled of perfume rather than gunpowder. Raleigh had survived the wars of France and the bogs of Ireland, but he was about to discover that the sharpest knives were not wielded by enemies on the battlefield, but by smiling courtiers in the corridors of power. To survive here, he would need more than courage. He would need to become a master of illusion. The court of Elizabeth I was not merely a government, it was a theater. It was a place of high drama, elaborate costumes, and coded languages, where a glance could mean promotion and a whisper could mean death. When Walter Raleigh stepped onto this stage in the early 1580s, he didn't just learn the lines, he rewrote the play. He was 30 years old, a veteran of French massacres and Irish slaughters, but in the presence of the Queen, he became something else entirely, a courtier of unparalleled brilliance. The chemistry between Raleigh and Elizabeth the Free is one of the most analyzed relationships in history. She was nearly 20 years his senior, a woman of immense intellect and terrifying temper, who had grown weary of the fawning yes-men who surrounded her. Raleigh was different. He was dangerous. He had the swagger of a pirate and the mind of a philosopher. He didn't just flatter her, he engaged her. We must address the legend immediately. The cloak. Did Sir Walter Raleigh really spread his expensive plush cloak over a mud puddle so the Queen's shoes wouldn't get dirty? History is silent on the facts, but loud on the symbolism. Whether it happened literally is irrelevant. It happened metaphorically every single day. The gesture perfectly encapsulates Raleigh's genius. He was willing to ruin a garment worth a year's wages for a momentary gesture of submission. He understood that in Elizabeth's court, you had to spend everything to gain everything. He treated her not just as a monarch, but as a celestial being, a Cynthia or Diana, the goddess of the moon. Elizabeth, in turn, was captivated. She loved his rough Devonshire accent, a reminder of her father, Henry VIII's earthy kingdom. She loved his wit. She gave him a nickname that was a playful pun on his heavy accent, Water. In her letters she would write, "Water, you are a menace," or "I am listening to water." The rise of Water was meteoric, and to the old nobility it was nauseating. They watched in horror as this impoverished fourth son of a country squire began to accumulate wealth that rivaled the great earldoms. Elizabeth showered him with gifts, but she was shrewd. She rarely gave him cash directly. Instead, she gave him the power to extract cash from her subjects. She granted him the monopoly on wine licenses. Every time a tavern owner in England wanted to sell a glass of wine, they had to pay a fee to Sir Walter Raleigh. He made a fortune from the thirst of the nation. She gave him the monopoly on the export of woolen broadcloths. She made him Lord Warden of the Stennaries, giving him control over the tin mines of the West Country. By 1587, he ascended to the position of captain of the Queen's Guard. This was not a desk job. This was the ultimate position of trust. It meant Raleigh was responsible for the Queen's physical body. He commanded the 50 tall, handsome gentlemen who guarded the palaces. He stood at the door of her private chambers. He wore a uniform of silver armor, and it was said that his court clothes were so encrusted with jewels that they were heavy to wear. One pair of his shoes was reported to be worth 6,000 gold pieces. He was the Sun King before Louis XIV was even born. He was arrogant, flashy, and utterly unapologetic. He built a magnificent estate at Sherborne. He commissioned poems. He sat for portraits where he looked down his nose at the viewer. The people of London hated him. They called him the upstart, the fox, and the viper. They hated his monopolies, which drove up prices. They hated his pride. But Raleigh didn't care. As long as the moon Elizabeth shone on him, the howling of the wolves meant nothing. But Raleigh was not satisfied with being a glorified bodyguard. His mind was too big for the palace. While other courtiers worried about who was dancing with whom, Raleigh was staring at maps. He was obsessed with the concept of empire. At this time, Spain owned the New World. Gold flowed from the Americas into Madrid, funding the Catholic armies that threatened England. Raleigh argued that England needed its own foothold. He didn't just want to raid Spanish ships, he wanted to plant English roots. In 1584, Elizabeth granted him a patent to discover, search, find out, and view such remote, heathen, and barbarous lands, not actually possessed of any Christian prince. Raleigh, bound by his duties as captain of the guard, could not sail himself. The Queen would not risk her water in the treacherous Atlantic. So he became the mastermind. He organized the logistics, he raised the funds, and he hired the captains. He sent 2 ships to scout the coast of North America. They returned with glowing reports of a paradise, a land of incredible abundance, inhabited by gentle, loving, and faithful people. Raleigh, with his marketer's instinct, named this new land Virginia. It was a stroke of genius, naming the land after the Virgin Queen, forever linking her chastity to the fertile soil of the New World. This led to the famous Roanoke expeditions. We often focus on the tragedy of the lost colony of 1587, the families who vanished, leaving only Croatoan carved into a post. For Raleigh, this was a crushing financial blow and a haunting failure. He had sent over 100 men, women, and children into the void, and they were gone. But we must look at what did survive. Raleigh's expeditions didn't bring back gold. They brought back something far more potent, something that would shape the culture of the world for centuries to come. First, the potato. Legend says Raleigh planted the first potatoes on his estate in Youghal, Ireland. It was a humble tuber, ugly and strange, but it would eventually become the staple food of the Irish people, leading to a population boom, and centuries later, a tragic famine. Raleigh changed the biology of Europe with a single sack of vegetables. Second, and more immediately impactful, tobacco. Native Americans had used tobacco for centuries, for ritual and medicinal purposes. Raleigh brought it to the English court as a luxury. He made smoking the height of fashion. There is a famous anecdote that captures this moment. Raleigh was sitting in his study smoking a silver pipe. A servant, new to the household, entered with a tankard of ale. Seeing smoke billowing from his master's nose and mouth, the servant panicked, thinking Raleigh was on fire. He threw the ale over Raleigh to put him out. Raleigh, dripping wet and smelling of beer and ash, supposedly laughed. He was a man who loved the theatricality of the new. He even wagered with the Queen that he could weigh the smoke produced by his pipe. She took the bet. Raleigh weighed the tobacco, smoked it, and then weighed the ash. The difference, he argued, was the weight of the smoke. The Queen paid up, remarking, "I have seen many men turn their gold into smoke, but you are the first who has turned smoke into gold." By the early 1590s, Raleigh was at the zenith. He was the Queen's favorite, a wealthy tycoon, a renowned poet, and the architect of England's colonial ambitions. He was the Shepherd of the Ocean, a title given to him by his friend, the poet Edmund Spenser. But Greek tragedy teaches us that the higher you fly, the more the gods resent you. Hubris, pride, is always followed by nemesis. Raleigh was approaching 40. He was rich and powerful, but he was also lonely. His relationship with the queen was intense, but it was sterile. It was a game of courtly love, not a marriage. He could never truly possess her, and she demanded that he possess no one else. She required total celibate devotion from her favorites. To marry without her permission was treason of the heart. Enter Elizabeth Bess Throckmorton. She was everything the queen was not, young, warm, and available. She was a gentlewoman of the privy chamber, living in the very heart of the palace under the queen's nose. We don't know exactly when it started. It began with glances across the room, whispered conversations in the corridors. Raleigh, the man who looked at empires, found himself captivated by a woman of flesh and blood. It was a reckless, suicidal romance. If the queen found out, it would be the end. But Raleigh, the gambler, rolled the dice. He seduced Bess. By the summer of 1591, she was pregnant. Panic set in. A pregnant, unwed maid of honor would be a scandal that could not be hidden. They married in secret, a hurried ceremony in the shadows. Raleigh returned to his duties, standing guard outside the queen's door, smiling, flattering, playing the part of the devoted servant, while his secret wife grew larger, with his child just a few rooms away. They managed to hide the pregnancy for months. Bess left court to give birth to a son, Madre, who was quickly sent to a wet nurse. She returned to court as if nothing had happened. It was a tightrope walk over a pit of vipers. Raleigh thought he could have it all, the queen's favor and a private life. He thought he was smarter than the system. But in the Tudor court, secrets were currency, and someone was always ready to pay. The whispers began. The rumors swirled. And finally, in May 1592, the truth reached the ears of Elizabeth I. The explosion was nuclear. The queen did not just feel disobeyed, she felt cuckolded. The man she had made from nothing, the man she called water, had betrayed her for a younger woman. The psychological wound was deep and unforgivable. Raleigh was recalled from the sea, where he was organizing a massive raid on Spanish shipping. He was dragged back to London. The silver armor was stripped away. The captain of the guard was arrested. The doors of the Tower of London, which he had once guarded, now swung open to swallow him. The golden age was over. The long, dark descent had begun. However, Raleigh was a man who refused to stay buried, even when the queen herself threw the dirt on his grave. While his enemies rejoiced at seeing the upstart finally locked away, fate, and the ocean he loved so dearly, had one more card to play. Just as the heavy oak doors seemed to seal his fate, a distant thunder from the Atlantic was rolling toward London, bringing with it a fortune so vast that it would force the furious queen to turn the key and let her water flow once again. The Tower of London in 1592 was not merely a prison. For Walter Raleigh, it was a purgatory of silence. The man who had organized the defenses of a nation and whose ships roamed the Atlantic was now confined to a stone room, staring at a patch of gray sky. But the irony of Raleigh's life was that he was often most dangerous when he was cornered. His imprisonment for the crime of marrying Bess Throckmorton was brief but humiliating. Yet even in disgrace, the queen found she could not do without him. In September 1592, English privateers, ships Raleigh had organized, captured the Madre de Deus, Mother of God. It was a Portuguese carrack, a floating treasury, the single richest prize ever taken by the English Navy. It was laden with spices, ebony, silks, and pearls worth £500,000, nearly half the net worth of the English treasury. When the ship was towed into Dartmouth Harbor, chaos erupted. The sailors began looting. The locals began looting. The queen was terrified her prize was disappearing into the pockets of peasants. She realized there was only one man in England with the authority to control these wild sea dogs, Raleigh. She released him from the tower not out of mercy but out of greed. He was sent to Dartmouth with a keeper, technically still a prisoner. The scene on the docks was surreal. As Raleigh arrived, the tough sailors who had been rioting stopped and cheered. They loved him. He was the shepherd of the ocean. Raleigh, pale from prison, but commanding as ever, restored order. He secured the Queen's treasure. He made her rich beyond her wildest dreams. And his reward? Banishment. The Queen took the money, but she did not forgive the heart. Raleigh was released from custody, but forbidden from returning to court. He took his wife Bess and retreated to Sherborne, in Dorset, an estate the Queen had given him in happier times. For the next 2 years, Raleigh lived the life of a country gentleman. He landscaped gardens, he built a new castle. He raised his son, Walter Raleigh, who was born in 1593, the first baby Mastermind, had sadly died in infancy. It looked like a happy ending, a quiet life with a woman he loved. But Raleigh was not built for quiet. The silence of the countryside screamed at him. He was a man of the arena. Every day he spent planting trees was a day he wasn't shaping history. He knew that to win back the Queen, to return to the center of the world, he needed a miracle. He didn't just need a victory, he needed a myth. He turned his eyes to the map of South America. Rumors had drifted across the ocean for decades about a city hidden in the interior of Guyana, modern-day Venezuela. The Spanish called it El Dorado, the Golden One. It was said to be a city where the king dusted himself in gold dust every morning and washed it off in a sacred lake at night, where the temples were roofed with gold plates. Raleigh became obsessed. He convinced himself it was real. He convinced investors it was real. In 1595, leaving his wife and young son behind, he sailed for the New World. This expedition was Raleigh at his finest and his most delusional. He led a small fleet up the Orinoco River. It was a journey into a humid, verdant hell. They battled mosquitoes, stifling heat, and strong currents. But Raleigh was in his element. He was a scholar warrior. He took notes on the flora and fauna. Crucially, he behaved differently than the Spanish conquistadors. The Spanish had enslaved and tortured the indigenous tribes in their lust for gold. Raleigh, playing the long game, treated them with respect. He told the local chieftains that he served a great queen across the sea, a virgin queen who was the enemy of the cruel Spanish. He distributed coins with Elizabeth's face on them. He forged alliances. To the indigenous people of the Orinoco, Raleigh was a liberator. But he found no city of gold. He found traces of ore. He found spar that sparkled, but no mines, no temples, no gilded king. He returned to England empty-handed. His enemies at court laughed. They called him a fraud. They said he had been hiding in Cornwall the whole time. Cornered again, Raleigh fought back with his pen. He wrote The Discovery of Guyana. It became an instant bestseller. It was a masterpiece of travel writing and propaganda. He described a land of unspeakable beauty, a land that was richer than Peru. He wrote, "Guyana is a country that hath yet her maidenhead." He promised that if England claimed this land, it would rival Spain. He didn't bring back gold. He brought back a dream of empire that would eventually lead to the British colonization of the region. The book worked. It didn't get him back into the Queen's inner circle, but it restored his reputation as a man of action. In 1596, he cemented this with blood. The English launched a massive raid on the Spanish port of Cadiz. Raleigh was one of the commanders. During the battle, the English fleet was hesitant to attack the Spanish galleons trapped in the harbor. Raleigh, in his ship the Warspite, broke rank. He sailed straight at the massive Spanish warships, ignoring the cannon fire. He later wrote that he answered the Spanish trumpets with a blare of trumpets of my own. It was a suicide run, and it was glorious. The Spanish panicked. They scuttled their own ships to prevent capture. Raleigh was wounded. A cannonball splinter tore into his calf, leaving him with a limp for the rest of his life. But he had led the charge. He returned to England a war hero. Finally, the ice around the Queen's heart began to thaw. She allowed him back at court. He resumed his duties as captain of the guard. He was back in the silver armor, but the court he returned to was dying. It was the late 1590s. Elizabeth was old. Her teeth were black, her face was painted with white lead to hide the wrinkles, and her temper was erratic. The court was now a snake pit of factions. On one side was Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, young, dashing, reckless, and the Queen's new favorite. He hated Raleigh. On the other side were the professionals, Raleigh, Robert Cecil, the Secretary of State, and Lord Cobham. The rivalry between Raleigh and Essex was the talk of London. Essex once famously said, "I will not be the second person in this kingdom." He saw Raleigh as his chief obstacle, but Essex was unstable. In 1601, he launched a foolish, doomed coup d'etat against the Queen. He marched on London. The rebellion failed within hours. Raleigh, as captain of the guard, was there to protect the Queen. When Essex was executed in the Tower courtyard, Raleigh watched from a window in the armory. Some said he gloated, blowing smoke from his pipe, but others said that as the axe fell, Raleigh turned away, tears in his eyes. He knew that with Essex gone, the balance was broken, and he was right. With Essex dead, the political predator Robert Cecil turned his eyes on the next threat, Raleigh. Cecil began a secret correspondence with James VI of Scotland, the man who would be the next king. In these letters, Cecil systematically assassinated Raleigh's character. He painted Raleigh and his friend Cobham as dangerous, atheistic, and anti-Scottish. He called Raleigh the Great Lucifer. King James, a superstitious man who feared witches and assassins, believed every word. Before he even crossed the border, James had decided that Walter Raleigh was his enemy. On March 24, 1603, the unthinkable happened. Queen Elizabeth I died. The Tudor dynasty, which had ruled for 118 years, was extinct. James VI of Scotland rode south to become James I of England. Raleigh rode to meet the new king, hoping to charm him as he had charmed Elizabeth. But the magic was gone. Raleigh was an Elizabethan relic, flashy, war-hungry, and proud. James was a Stuart, shabby, peace-loving, and deeply insecure. When they met, James famously punned on Raleigh's name, "I have heard Raleigh of thee." The fall was swift and brutal. Within weeks, Raleigh was stripped of his monopolies. He was fired as captain of the guard. He was evicted from his London house. Then came the killing blow. In July 1603, a vague, half-baked conspiracy called the Main Plot was uncovered. It was a plan to depose James and put his cousin Arbella Stuart on the throne. Raleigh's friend, Lord Cobham, was implicated. Under questioning, the weak-willed Cobham cracked and named Raleigh. Raleigh was arrested. He was innocent of the plot. He was too smart to get involved in such a foolish scheme, but that didn't matter. He was a convenient scapegoat. In November 1603, Raleigh was put on trial for treason. Because of the plague in London, the trial was held in the Great Hall of Winchester Castle. This trial is remembered as one of the darkest stains on English legal history. Raleigh was not allowed a lawyer. He was not allowed to call witnesses. He had to defend himself against the best legal minds in the country. The prosecutor was Attorney General Edward Coke, a man of venomous ambition. Coke didn't just prosecute, he abused. "Thou art the most vile and execrable traitor that ever lived," Coke screamed. "I want to starve you of your cunning." Thou hast an English face but a Spanish heart. Raleigh, standing alone in the dock, was magnificent. The arrogance of his youth vanished. In its place was a cool, steely dignity. He dismantled Coke's arguments. He demanded to confront his accuser, Cobham, face to face. "If my Lord Cobham be a traitor, what is that to me?" Raleigh asked. "Let him be brought here. If he accuse me to my face, I will confess the truth." The judges refused. They knew Cobham would retract his statement if he saw Raleigh. The trial lasted one day. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Guilty. The Lord Chief Justice pronounced the sentence. Sir Walter Raleigh was to be drawn on a hurdle to the place of execution, hanged until half dead, cut down alive, his private parts cut off and burned before his eyes, his head severed and his body quartered. The crowd in Winchester had gathered to jeer the arrogant upstart. But by the end of the trial, the mood had shifted completely. Raleigh's courage in the face of such obvious injustice had won them over. One observer wrote that never was a man so hated and so popular in so short a time. Raleigh was sent back to prison to await his death. He wrote that heartbreaking farewell letter to Bess. He prepared his soul. But King James was a man of strange theatricality. He wanted to show his power. On a gray December morning, the other conspirators were led out to the scaffold. Raleigh watched from his window, waiting for his turn. The first men were prepared for the axe. The crowd waited. Suddenly, a sheriff rode in with a warrant. "Stop the execution." The king had granted a reprieve. It was a psychological torture game. Raleigh was not to be executed, but he was not to be free. He was civilly dead. His life was spared, but his world was gone. The heavy gates of the Tower of London groaned shut behind him. He was 51 years old. He would not walk out of those gates as a free man for 13 years. The world outside moved on. The Jacobean era began, an era of decadence, peace with Spain, and political corruption. But inside the Bloody Tower, the last Elizabethan was not idle. If he could not conquer the world with a sword, he would conquer it with a pen. And so the sword was forcibly traded for the quill. Most men, stripped of their titles, their wealth, and their freedom, would have withered into obscurity within the damp confines of the state prison. But Raleigh was not most men. As the heavy silence of the civil death settled over him, he did not succumb to the darkness. Instead, he decided to turn his stone cell into a cockpit from which he would survey the entirety of human history, proving to the king that you can imprison a man's body, but you cannot shackle a mind that has touched the horizon. The Tower of London is designed to crush the spirit. It is a machine of stone and damp built to remind men of their smallness against the might of the state. But for Sir Walter Raleigh, the tower became something entirely different. For 13 years, from 1603 to 1606, the Bloody Tower was not a dungeon. It was the intellectual capital of England. Raleigh was civilly dead in the eyes of the law. His titles were gone. His lands were seized. But his mind was untouchable. King James I had locked him away to silence him. But in doing so, he inadvertently created the conditions for Raleigh's greatest achievements. The conditions of his imprisonment were strange, almost surreal. He was allowed 2 rooms on the upper floor of the Bloody Tower. He was permitted to walk along the wall, a path still known today as Raleigh's Walk, where the citizens of London would gather below, gazing up at the legendary figure pacing back and forth, a living ghost of the Elizabethan age. Most remarkably, his family moved in with him. Bess Throckmorton, the wife who had cost him everything, refused to abandon him. They lived there together. In 1605, amidst the gloom of the prison, she gave birth to their 3rd son, Carew Raleigh. The child was christened in the Tower Chapel. It was a domestic life forged in the crucible of captivity. Raleigh transformed his cell into a laboratory and a library. He was an alchemist, fascinated by chemistry and medicine. He set up a furnace and stills in the garden shed. He brewed a concoction known as the Great Cordial, a medicine made of pearl, musk, hartshorn, and 30 other ingredients. It became famous across Europe. Even the Queen, James's wife, Anne of Denmark, swore by it. But his true escape was writing. Denied the ability to make history, Raleigh decided to record it. He embarked on a project of staggering ambition, the history of the world. He intended to write the story of humanity from the creation in Genesis down to his own time. He wrote millions of words by candlelight, surrounded by stacks of books borrowed from the great libraries of England. The first volume, published in 1614, is a literary titan. It is dense, opinionated, and magnificent, but it was also a subtle weapon. In discussing the rise and fall of ancient empires, Raleigh was quietly critiquing the tyranny of modern kings. He argued that kings were not gods. They were men who were accountable to God and to history. If a king ruled unjustly, he would fall. King James, who believed in the divine right of kings, the idea that kings are answerable only to God, hated the book. He tried to suppress it, complaining that Raleigh was too saucy in censuring princes, but the public devoured it. To them, the voice coming from the tower was the voice of truth. Raleigh had a powerful patron during these dark years, Prince Henry, the king's eldest son. Henry was everything his father was not. He was athletic, martial, Protestant, and fiercely anti-Spanish. He idolized Raleigh. He saw the old prisoner not as a traitor, but as a mentor, a link to the glory days of Elizabeth. Henry would frequently visit the tower to hear Raleigh's stories of the sea and war. It was Prince Henry who famously remarked, "No king but my father would keep such a bird in a cage." For Raleigh, Henry was the lifeline. The plan was simple. James would eventually die, Henry would become King Henry IX, and Raleigh would be released to lead England's navy once more. Raleigh wrote the history of the world specifically for the education of this young prince. Then the hammer fell. In November 1612, Prince Henry fell ill, likely with typhoid fever. The doctors were helpless. In a desperate final attempt, the Queen sent for Raleigh's great cordial from the tower. It was administered to the dying prince. It revived him for a moment, but it was too late. Prince Henry died at the age of 18. With him died Raleigh's future. Raleigh was devastated. He put down his pen. He never finished the history of the world. He wrote in the final published lines, "It is now time that I put away the pen, for the world which I have written of is broken." For 4 more years, Raleigh languished in the tower, an old man forgotten by the court. But the fire in his belly had not gone out. It had merely turned into desperation. By 1616, Raleigh was 64 years old. He had suffered multiple strokes. He was graying and weary. But he had one card left to play: greed. King James was broke. The royal treasury was empty, drained by the king's lavish lifestyle. Raleigh sent a proposal to the king: "Release me, and I will go back to Guyana. I know where the gold mine is. I will bring back enough gold to pay off the national debt." It was a lie, or at least a delusion. Raleigh didn't know exactly where the mine was. He only had the vague promises of his previous voyage 20 years earlier, but he sold the lie with the conviction of a prophet. The king was tempted, but there was a massive diplomatic problem: Spain. Since Elizabeth's death, King James had pursued a policy of peace with Spain. The Spanish ambassador, Count Gondomar, was one of the most powerful men in London. Gondomar knew Raleigh was a hawk who hated Spain. He warned King James, "If you let this pirate loose in the Atlantic, he will attack Spanish settlements. That means war. James, ever the coward, came up with a cruel compromise. He would let Raleigh go, but with a specific condition. Raleigh could look for gold, but if he touched a single Spaniard or attacked a single Spanish settlement, he would be executed upon his return. It was a trap. Raleigh knew that the Spanish claimed all of Guyana. To go there was to trespass. To dig for gold was to steal. Conflict was inevitable, but Raleigh was a drowning man. He took the rope, even though he knew it was a noose. On March 19th, 1616, the gates of the tower opened. Raleigh walked out, blinking in the sunlight. He was free, but he was walking on a razor's edge. He spent everything he had to outfit the expedition. His wife Bess sold her estate. They invested their last penny. He built a magnificent flagship, the Destiny. It was one of the most powerful ships of its time. The fleet set sail in June 1617. It was a voyage of the damned from the start. The Atlantic crossing was a nightmare. Violent storms scattered the fleet. Sickness ravaged the crew. 42 men died on the Destiny alone. Raleigh himself was struck down by a violent fever. For weeks he lay in his cabin, delirious, unable to eat, surviving only on preserved lemons. He was so weak he could not write. He could only dictate his journal. When they finally reached the coast of South America in November 1617, Raleigh was a wreck. He was too ill to walk, let alone march through the jungle. He had to make a command decision. He would stay with the ships at the mouth of the Orinoco River to guard against the Spanish Navy. He would send a smaller force up the river to find the mine. The command of the river party was given to his most loyal friend, Lawrence Keemis. And with Keemis went Raleigh's heart, his 23-year-old son, Wat. Young Wat was a firebrand, reckless, brave, and desperate to prove himself to his legendary father. Raleigh gave Keemis strict orders. Find the mine. Do not attack the Spanish. If you find the Spanish are too strong, retreat. Do not start a war. Raleigh watched from the deck of the Destiny as the smaller boats disappeared into the green mouth of the river. He would sit there for weeks, sweating in the tropical heat, waiting for the gold that would save his life. Up the river, disaster unfolded. The English expedition found that the Spanish had built a settlement, San Tomé, right on the banks of the river, blocking the path to the supposed mine. The Spanish fired on the English, starving and desperate, fired back. The strict order was broken. The fighting was chaotic. In the heat of the battle, young Wat Raleigh, shouting, "Come on, men, this is the only mine you will ever find," led a charge against the Spanish fortifications. A Spanish musket ball caught him in the chest. He fell dead instantly. The English took the town, sacking and burning it. But when Keemis interrogated the survivors and searched the area, the truth came crashing down. There was no mine. There never had been. The rocks were just rocks. The El Dorado was a fever dream. Keemis had failed. He had broken the king's peace, and he had lost Raleigh's son. The river party rode back down to the coast in silence. They carried the news that would destroy Sir Walter Raleigh. When Keemis boarded the Destiny and told Raleigh the truth, Raleigh didn't explode in rage immediately. He went cold. He looked at Keemis, his friend of 30 years, and said, "You have undone me." He refused to accept Keemis's apologies. He told Keemis that he would have to answer to the king for Wat's death. He cast him out of his cabin. Keemis, broken by his master's rejection and his own guilt, went to his cabin. A few minutes later, a gunshot was heard. Raleigh sent a boy to check. The boy returned, saying Keemis said he was just cleaning a pistol that had misfired. Half an hour later, the boy went back in and found Keemis dead. He had shot himself in the ribs, but the ball had hit a bone and failed to kill him. So he had taken a long knife and driven it through his own heart. Raleigh was now alone. His son was dead, His best friend was dead. The gold was a lie, and he had committed an act of war against Spain. His crew wanted to turn pirate. They urged him to seize the Spanish treasure fleet, to go to France, to go anywhere but England. But Raleigh was tired. The fight had gone out of him. He was a man of honor, and he had given his word to return. He wrote a letter to his wife Bess from the ship. It is a letter of unadulterated agony. I was loath to write because I knew not how to comfort you, and God knows I never knew what sorrow meant till now. Comfort your heart, dearest Bess. I shall sorrow for us both. I shall sorrow the less because I have not long to sorrow, because not long to live. My brains are broken. In June 1618, the Destiny sailed into Plymouth Harbor. The news had beaten him there. The Spanish ambassador Gondomar had stormed into King James's chamber shouting, "Pirates! Pirates! Pirates!" James, terrified of Spain, ordered Raleigh's immediate arrest. Raleigh stepped onto the English soil, knowing he was a dead man walking. He was arrested by his own cousin, Sir Lewis Stukely, who would later betray him and steal his remaining money, earning the nickname Sir Judas. They began the slow journey to London. Raleigh, his body failing, his heart broken, tried one last desperate trick. He faked madness. He used chemical emetics to make himself vomit and break out in sores. He hoped to buy time, to write a defense, to beg for mercy. But there was no mercy left in the Stuart court. He was brought back to London, but not to the Tower immediately. He was held in his wife's house for a few days, a cruel taunt of domesticity, before being transferred back to the stone cage. The legal problem for King James was tricky. Raleigh was already a condemned man from the 1603 trial. You cannot try a man who is already legally dead. So they didn't give him a new trial. They simply reactivated the old death warrant. The Lord Chief Justice told him, "Execution is granted." Raleigh was taken to the gatehouse at Westminster on the night of October 28th, 1618. It was his last night on earth. Bess came to him. It was a farewell of crushing sadness. They had been partners in ambition, in crime, in prison, and in tragedy. Now at the end she told him that the government had granted her the right to bury his body. Raleigh, retaining his dark wit to the very end, smiled and said, "It is well, dear Bess, that thou mayest dispose of that dead which thou hadst not always the disposing of when it was alive." The clock struck midnight. Bess left. Raleigh sat down to write his final poem. He wrote these lines in his Bible by the light of a flickering candle. "Even such is time that takes in trust our youth, our joys, our all we have, and pays us but with earth and dust, who in the dark and silent grave, when we have wandered all our ways, shuts up the story of our days. But from this earth, this grave, this dust, my God shall raise me up, I trust." He blew out the candle. The sharp medicine was waiting. As the smoke from that final candle drifted into the cold stone ceiling of the gatehouse, the sun began to creep over a London that was already awake and buzzing with anticipation. Outside, the gears of the state were grinding into motion, preparing a spectacle intended to humiliate the old traitor amidst the festivities of the Lord Mayor's parade. But the government had made a critical error in their calculations. They assumed they were executing a broken old man, unaware that the master showman had prepared one final devastating act that would steal the show from the king himself. The morning of Friday, October 29th, 1618, was chosen with cynical precision. It was Lord Mayor's Day, the biggest festive holiday in the London calendar. The streets were expected to be clogged with pageants, floats, and drunken revelry. The government hoped the execution of Sir Walter Raleigh would be a footnote, buried under the noise of trumpets and the cheering for the new mayor. They underestimated the man. They underestimated the crowd. Raleigh was held in the gatehouse of the old palace yard at Westminster. He woke early. He was 65 years old and his body was shaking, not from fear, but from the malaria he had contracted years ago in the swamps of the New World. He was terrified that the crowd would see him shivering and think he was trembling with cowardice. He dressed with the meticulous care of a bridegroom. He wore a black velvet nightgown over a hair-colored satin doublet and a black wrought waistcoat. He put on a rough band, black-cut taffeta breeches, and ash-colored silk stockings. He topped it all with a black velvet hat with a jeweled band. He was determined to look like the Elizabethan courtier one last time. He had a light breakfast and smoked a pipe of tobacco, the habit he had given to England. It was a final act of defiance, a quiet communion with the leaf that had made his fortune and ruined his health. When the sheriffs came for him at 8 a.m., the crowd was so thick that the officials had to batter their way through with staves. The plan to bury the event in the Lord Mayor's Day festivities had failed spectacularly. Thousands had turned their backs on the parade to watch the death of the last Elizabethan. Raleigh was led to the scaffold. He saw his old friends in the crowd. He saw the Earl of Arundel. He saw the nobility who had come to pay respects. He was weak, his voice was faint, but his spirit was incandescent. He realized the wind was blowing his voice away from the lords on the balconies. He asked them to come closer. In a surreal moment of respect, the execution was paused, while the Earl of Arundel and the nobles climbed down from their balconies and stood right on the scaffold with the condemned man. Raleigh spoke for 45 minutes. He did not plead for his life. He pleaded for his reputation. He systematically dismantled every lie told about him. He swore on his salvation that he had never been an agent of France. He swore he had not rejoiced at the death of the Earl of Essex. He spoke of his loyalty to the king who was killing him. He ended with a simple request. I have a long journey to go, and therefore must take my leave. He took off his gown and doublet. He called for the executioner, Gregory Brandon. Brandon was a seasoned killer, but he was visibly shaken. He knelt before Raleigh and asked for forgiveness. Raleigh placed his hands on the man's shoulders and forgave him freely. Then, the moment that has echoed through history, Raleigh asked to see the axe. Brandon hesitated. He tried to hide the blade behind his back. Raleigh's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. I prithee, let me see it. Dost thou think that I am afraid of it? He took the heavy axe. He ran his thumb along the edge. He smiled, a genuine weary smile of a man who sees the end of pain. He turned to the crowd and delivered the line that should be carved on his tombstone. This is a sharp medicine, but it is a physician for all diseases and miseries. He lay down. The executioner asked him to face east toward the Holy Land. Raleigh shifted his position but remarked, So the heart be right, it is no matter which way the head lies. He prayed silently. He gave the signal. He stretched out his hands, but Brandon froze. The crowd held its breath. The silence was absolute. Raleigh, his head on the block, waited and waited. The tension was unbearable. Finally, muffled by the wood, Raleigh's voice roared out, impatient and fearless. What dost thou fear? Strike, man, strike! The axe fell. It took 2 blows. A groan went up from the crowd that was described as a sound of universal horror. When the executioner lifted the head, showing the gray hair and the familiar pointed beard, no one cheered. Someone in the crowd shouted, We have not such another head to be cut off. The body was wrapped in his velvet cloak. But the story does not end in the coffin. Enter Bess Throckmorton. Throughout history, widows have mourned. They have worn black, they have wept, they have built monuments. Bess did something else. She committed an act of devotion so macabre and so tender that it defies modern comprehension. She used her influence to claim his head. She had it embalmed by a surgeon. The skin was preserved, the features set. She placed it in a red velvet bag. For the next 29 years, Bess Throckmorton did not let him go. She kept the bag with her at all times. It sat on her table during the day. It slept near her bed at night. When visitors came to her home, if they were people who had loved Raleigh, she would sometimes open the bag and show them the face of the man who had dreamed of El Dorado. She was not insane. She was a woman who had fought queens and kings for this man, and she refused to let the king have the final word. By keeping his head, she was keeping his agency. She was saying that his body belonged to her, not to the state. When she finally died in 1647, the head passed to their son Carew Raleigh. It was eventually buried with him, finally returning to the earth nearly 3 decades after the axe fell. So, what is the sum of Sir Walter Raleigh? He was a man of contradictions so vast they tear the fabric of simple narrative. He was a poet who wrote of delicate love, yet he oversaw the massacre at Smerwick. He was a courtier who spent fortunes on shoes, yet he slept in the mud of the Orinoco jungle. He was a liar who forged maps, yet he wrote a history of the world that championed the truth. He failed to find El Dorado. He failed to establish a permanent colony at Roanoke. He failed to keep the Queen's favor. He failed to save his son. By the metrics of his own ambition, he died a failure. But look around. The smoke that drifts from a cigarette, however unhealthy we now know it to be, is his legacy. The potato on your dinner plate is his legacy. The very concept of a British Empire, of an English-speaking North America, was his dream before it was anyone else's reality. The state capital of North Carolina bears his name, not because he succeeded, but because he tried. He was the bridge between the medieval and the modern. He had one foot in the age of chivalry, wearing armor and writing sonnets, and one foot in the age of science and commerce, distilling medicines and founding trade companies. But perhaps his greatest legacy is the manner of his leaving. By dying so bravely, by turning his execution into a piece of theater that shamed the king, he undermined the Stuart monarchy. He became a martyr for liberty. When the English Civil War broke out 20 years later, the men who fought against the king carried Raleigh's History of the World in their saddlebags. The ghost of Raleigh helped chop off the head of King Charles I. If you walk into St. Margaret's Church in Westminster today, right next to the Great Abbey, you will find a stained glass window. It depicts Raleigh, surrounded by the symbols of the New World. His headless body is buried somewhere beneath the altar, alongside Caxton the printer. But you won't find him there. To find Raleigh, you have to go to the edge of the sea. You have to look west, where the gray Atlantic meets the sky. That is where he lives, in the hunger for the horizon, in the reckless gamble for the unknown, and in the sharp medicine of a life lived without safety. He was the man who tried to swallow the world, and in the end, the world swallowed him. But for a few glorious, bloody, golden decades, he made it taste like possibility.